Get a deeper connection with the Cougars of BYU sports.
God gives us a gift, and we use that gift until he takes it away.
Deep Blue.
Just sitting down afterward and being really tired and thinking like, wow, I just won the U.S. championship.
This is Deep Blue. Here's your host, Jason Shepard.
Thanks for tuning in for a new episode of Deep Blue. This is the show where we get to know the person behind the number that you see on the field or the court. These are the true stories of BYU athletes from their own mouths, and mix things up a little bit. My guests, yes, that is plural. My guests work in the sports information offices at BYU. I have known them for a very long time. We don't need to get into how long because none of us want to be reminded how old we are. They are the authors of the book titled 100 Years of BYU Football. It is a pleasure to have Duff, Tittle, and Brett Pyne in studio with me, guys. It's always good to see you. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having us.
You bet.
Yeah, we're doing well. Thanks, Shep.
Because we have such this long history, I feel like anytime I'm around you, I need to be asking, who's available for interviews today? And, those types of things. Those are usually the conversations that we have. So the fact that we get to do some other things today, that's pretty exciting. And speaking of exciting, you guys, it's been out for a little while. Your book, again, 100 Years of BYU Football. It's doing well, which is awesome. Take me through the gathering process on all this, because I can't even imagine the amount of information that you guys had to sift through and seek out to go over that much time, in BYU football history.
Yeah, it goes way back. Actually, probably the genesis of it is clear back in Legacy Hall time, back in 2003, when I was digging to try to put together that museum. Came across a lot of really cool stuff. A few years later, we did a book called BYU Cougar Vault. I spent a lot of time in the special collections area in the library at BYU and found some even more cool stuff. And then as time went on, we did some other things, and we ended up digitizing the athletic department archives, which is, if you can imagine, the large filing cabinets that are five drawers and wide. There were 30 of them. And Jenny Wheeler, who was our office manager at the time, took on that project. And in the process of just, going through that and digitizing that, it made it way easy to find things compared to in the past. Imagine going into 30 filing cabinets and trying to find the something new. But the digital process made it so we could search, and that happened in the early 2000s. And so this book is kind of a little bit a product of that, because we were able to find things when we're going back looking into our history that we didn't know existed, or that we just kind of stumbled into. So that's part of the genesis of this. And then, obviously we've both been here for over 25 years. So together we have half of the history of BYU football, sort of.
Well, and I think you've talked, with a lot of different people over the years, and some of the things that maybe weren't as widely part of the public narrative that people, all heard about, maybe about a particular game or something that was going on. But all of those things just kind of contributed eventually, and it was really Duff, giving him credit, is like the idea being, hey, 100 years is coming up. We should consider doing something to help recognize, tell some of the stories, help people have a better appreciation for some of the things that have gone on over the history. And of course, at that early part of that discussion, you really don't know all the things you're going to come across as you're researching and finding things, and as that narrative of what the history of the program really is all about kind of developed as we were working on it. So it was fun for us that way too, because we were, we've been part of the fandom of BYU football since we were kids. So I mean, that part of it was fun too, just to discover and find things and see how things happened.
Oh, Brett, it's like you knew where I was going to go next, because we're going to get into some of the specifics of the book. But I want to talk about you guys, because as you mentioned, you guys have been fans for a long time. You guys have known each other for a very long time. You both were raised in Orem, correct?
Correct.
So nearby. You talk about the fandom. Being this close to BYU as you guys are growing up, what did BYU football mean to you guys when you were growing up as kids?
It meant pretty much everything to us. And looking back, you don't really think about it as much. But, I mean, I remember, Duff and I moved into a neighborhood where Duff lived. And so I was 4 years old. He was 5. And we have younger siblings the same age that were, at the time, young babies, basically. And our mothers were walking the younger kids around the block, so to speak, and ran into each other on the corner. And Duff and I were the older of the kids tagging along. So
we were just along for the walk.
We became friends from that moment on, and just did all kinds of things. But our world really did revolve around, a lot to credit our parents that were people that introduced us to BYU athletics. I mean, this isn't football, but the first year the Marriott Center opened, I remember me and my dad on the top row, season tickets of the Marriott Center. Back in those days, 23,000 people in there. So from a very young age, we were very much attuned to BYU sports and enjoyed what that meant, at least to us. And in some of those years, it meant that we would go and sit in what was the old knot hole, the north end zone temporary bleachers before they expanded the stadium, and we'd watch games there. But then we'd run off with the Nerf football on the grass hill that was behind, and just play football ourselves too. So some of those earlier times, we probably didn't know as much about every single play or the players. But I remember being disappointed when we went to that first bowl game and Gary Scheide got hurt, and it's like, oh, darn it. And then I remember when Gifford Nielsen became the starting quarterback partway through the next season, and kind of took over the starting job and started playing so well, and that was so fun. And John Vanderwooden was one of my players. Number 8, he was the receiver. I used to love watching him play, and so we had these affinities that just kind of took hold of us, and it was supported by our families, and so it really was a big part of our lives.
What about you, Duff? What stands out to you about that time being a BYU fan?
Yeah, it was a time period where in the state of Utah we didn't have any pro teams, so BYU was our teams, whatever season that we were in. And as we got into being like junior high and high school, it really was like the glory days of the program. You had these larger than life people playing football and basketball and golf and baseball. And so we were big fans. We were really caught up in it. And I remember, early on we would go with our dads and sit in different sections. And then when we became old enough where I felt that they could just drop us off, it was like to a football game, 4 hours of free babysitting. We'd pay $1 to get in, as Brett mentioned, as part of the Knothole gang. And we spent a lot of time. We just loved it. We ate it up. And those names that Brett mentioned were, they were like our heroes. Those were the people we wanted to be. And when we played football in the neighborhood, in front of our houses or out in, at the elementary school, that's who we were.
Yeah.
We were those guys. And Brett was really fast and loved the wide receivers, and I was slow, but I could throw it. So I loved the quarterbacks and the tight ends.
So I know, Brett, you mentioned a couple of names of guys that, growing up. Do you have a favorite BYU football player? Like who was your favorite player?
Wow. That's
hard.
That's a hard one, because there's so many guys that, especially having worked with so many of the teams over the last, couple of decades. I mean, I've said this to him many times. He probably thinks I'm just joking, but I always say that Ty is my all-time favorite, just because, I mean, if you know Ty as a person, aside from the fact that he's the Heisman Trophy winner and all that kind of stuff, there's not many better than that guy. Just a really classy guy. But the hard part is there's so many. I mean, it's just amazing how many people have done so many good things and contributed to what has become the legacy of BYU football. And that's one thing that we kind of hoped in this process as we were getting into it. It's like, hey, how do we best recognize all these people? I mean, you can't write about everybody and everything they did. There's so many. You'd have volumes of things. But, we tried to research and find names, everyone that played and all these kinds of things, just so that, hey, they deserve to be recognized for what they did.
What about you, Duff? Favorite player? Anyone stand out for you?
I have a hard time with that, just like Brett, obviously. I'm a big Ty fan. As a kid, though, I was all about Jimmy Mack. I love Jim McMahon. It always felt as if it didn't matter what the game situation was. If we were behind, if the defense could just get a stop and get Jim the ball back, we had a chance. And we always felt like we were never out of a game with him at quarterback. There's a lot of great names. In fact, in 2012, Brett and I worked on a book. I wrote it. He did all the editing for it, called What It Means to Be a Cougar. And there were 65 roughly former players that were interviewed during that time period. And we used maybe 15 to 20% of those interviews. And that's kind of the genesis really of this book is, for me at that time period, I went all the way back. I interviewed a guy that was on the 1942 football team, the first football team to beat BYU. He was 92 years old. It was amazing. But then I got to interview all these guys who were the heroes of my childhood. And when we finished, it was a very specific book.
Mm-hmm.
And we had like 80% of the interviews didn't get used because they didn't fit the genre of the book. And those interviews sat in a I guess a box folder in the cloud, just kind of kept nagging at me, almost like there was this kind of feeling like, you got to get those interviews out. You got to tell those stories. So when we came to this 100-year thing, we thought, now's the time to, because those are the stories of behind the scenes.
Yes, that's what people want to know, the things they didn't know or that maybe they weren't allowed to know at the time. You know what I mean? They love that stuff.
For sure. And when I was interviewing like Brandon Doman, we were talking about LaVell's final game, up at Utah, and the events of that last drive, and he's telling me stuff. I mean, Shep, I'm on the sidelines. I'm probably 15, 20 feet from LaVell when all this is going down, and Brandon's telling me stuff that I didn't know happened in the huddle, on that final drive, in the post-game interviews afterwards. And I just was like, I was there. How did I not know some of this stuff?
Sure.
Yeah. And that's the stuff that was really kind of haunting me, if you will, to tell that story.
Yeah, I mean, so it's hard to say that there is a favorite, but that is something that you hope that for everyone has their own experiences and that they come from different eras. Maybe it's some of the ones that are in eras older than Duff and I, that they appreciate some of the stuff. It's like, this happened. I mean, we've had some people reach out that their dads played in the earlier eras than that were happy, and to see that there was a mention of their family and some of that kind of thing. But the newer generation, they're going to have people that they connect with, and hopefully through all of that, people can find different ways that they can relive some of those favorite things that they've experienced through BYU football.
You obviously and have touched on it that you have a connection to a lot of people that are connected with BYU football. And when it came time for this book, you specifically asked Ty Detmer and then Kalani Sitake to write the foreword and the afterword. Why those two?
Well, Pyne loves Ty, as he already talked.
Yep.
I also love Kalani.
That's
it's
true.
Probably bias on my part, but
and I say that in jest because clearly I love both of those men too. They're outstanding representatives of the university and the football program throughout the last 30 years or more. So that was kind of an easy choice actually.
I think really, if you look at the history of the program, that if you're going to have someone speak out, kind of almost in a way representing all the former players, I mean, who better than the guy that won the Heisman Trophy, that was the top player in the nation when he played, and he has such a unique story and way he goes about things, and is beloved by people that know him, and beloved by people that have only just seen him play too. So, and Kalani obviously is our current coach and someone that's, if you know Kalani, he mentions this when in the book, but he was a fan first.
Yep.
And he's had different interactions with the football program that have helped him in his life, before he became part of it, And he goes on to play for LaVell and then eventually to become the coach. And so, those two, just like Duff said, they just seemed like the logical at least in our minds, wants to do it.
Let's dive into some of the specifics in the book in terms of BYU's history. How did football get started at Brigham Young Academy? What was the genesis of the actual program?
I guess you kind of have to go back to the late 1800s because we played for 3 years during that time period, and it was becoming the thing in the United States. It was becoming a popular sport. We had some administrators who had played back east and gone to other schools, and there was a real interest among the fans base to get it started at BYU. So it got a jump start. There were 3 seasons that were played. There were lots of reasons why it went away, but it did. It was more or less banned from church schools, and it went away after 3 years. And then in the late 1919, roughly, right around there, they wanted to bring it back. It never really went away. There was always little pickup games and club teams and things going on campus. But the student body was really interested in seeing it come back. And so there was a letter that was written to Salt Lake, and they asked the Board of Trustees, who was run by David O. McKay at that particular time, the Department of Education, and he had been a football player, and it got some traction, and eventually they agreed to allow the university to bring the game back. So I had a freshman team in 1921 to get things started, and then the first intercollegiate team played its first game in 1922.
Those early eras were, you mentioned the academy.
Yeah.
You had high school kids, you had college-age kids, and they were playing against high schools in the YMCA or whatever, So it was not exactly the same as Duff alludes to when you get into the actual intercollegiate varsity, quote-unquote, team that took place in 22. So
yeah, by that time, it had become – there was national organizations for it by 1922. And we also had a local league that we could join and play in. And so the timing was right, and we got rolling again.
There are a lot of things about sports that we love, and one of the aspects that can be good and bad, I guess, depending on how you look at it, is rivals and rivalries, right? And the rivalry with the University of Utah has been around a long, long time. And for those of us locally, we certainly understand the importance of it and how big it can get and how great of a rivalry it is. What do you think has made this rivalry so great over the years? Because it has lasted a long time.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, really early on, like as Duff said, there were a couple of years in those late part of the 1800s where they did play a little bit, in those academy days. And then as they get a varsity team in 22, and it's like, okay, we're going to play, we're going to be part of this. One reason is just proximity. They're right down the street, and so that plays a big role in it. Obviously, that there's so much that's in common, so much that people, you even today, you see it where it's like you have families that half the families on this side of the fence, in terms of their allegiance, the others on the other, and so BYU competing and Utah State at the time as well, you have these local schools, and unlike today where, especially in today's world where it seems like geography means, nothing, everyone goes everywhere, but, that was the world that those were going to be your common, opponents. Yeah. And I think, and Utah had some successful teams in those eras and were good. And so it was the team that you wanted to be able to beat.
One of the things that we found out in the book is, as we look through those eras of, the 40s and 50s and even into the 60s, we couldn't understand why couldn't we compete very well? Why was there a lot of, lopsided games? And for a period of time, there were 10 games in a row that were played up in Salt Lake City for some reason. But as we dove down into that, we kind of unearthed something for this book that we realized, oh, okay, there's the reason. And it was an imbalance of opportunities with regards to scholarships. And it wasn't until Ernest Wilkinson came along in the 50s, and early on, he was very much an amateur guy. He really believed in amateur athletics and felt like this scholarship thing and other things were, taking away from that. So he held out a while and kind of fought a fight to try to keep things really at the amateur level. But after a while realized we're not playing in a level playing field. Others even in our state have scholarship opportunities that we don't. And our coaches were saying it's hurting us. If we're really going to compete, if we really want to compete, we've got to even that playing field. And somewhere in the early to mid 50s, that changed. And I won't tell you the whole story because you'll have to read about it in the book.
I love it. You got to buy the book.
But in a way, it was a bit of a revelation for us, I think, to realize, oh, okay. Because then that happened, and then we committed to building a new stadium. And in the process of doing research, Brett found a lot of really cool information about that. And then, all of a sudden, we started to get going a little bit. We brought in a coach that was really good prior to LaVell, and Tommy Husbeth did a great job of kind of combining all these things together and getting the program moving along. And he was the one that first saw, hey, I got a quarterback that can really sling it. And we should be taking advantage of that. And so with Virgil Carter at the helm, we finally won a conference title in 1965 and probably should have repeated in 66. The guys on those two teams will tell you, our 62 team was way more talented. They just lost a game late in the season that cost them the title. And that's also the genesis of what LaVell saw. He was a defensive guy. He was on the other side of the ball trying to stop them in practice and eventually the coordinator. And he realized, hey, those were magical years. But they were also magical years at a couple of other schools around the country that had similar, uniqueness to them about the university, and they won with the forward pass. And that's those time periods are genesis to what LaVell started to think, hey, I think maybe we got something here that we can make work at BYU. Well,
and back to the rivalry, as that developed, how BYU fared in the rivalry completely flipped, and really became a dominant player in that rivalry during that time. But even back, Duff talked about scholarships in the 50s, but another significant thing that really kind of brought the BYU-Utah rivalry to people's knowledge, now national television, and it's easy to follow things online, whoever you want to follow, right? And in those days, it was the second season of national television for college football, and BYU and Utah was selected as one of the games. So they'd have literally a game a week kind of thing. And it was Thanksgiving, and 60 million people watched that game. And so that, you look at who's heard of BYU football. I mean, that has to be one of the things, obviously, that brought to the attention of a lot of other people. Hey, what is this BYU football team? What is this BYU-Utah rivalry, And even though BYU was a heavy underdog, they were very competitive in that game. And so all of those things do play into probably where that rivalry has grown over the years.
All right, when we come back, we're going to get into the greatness of LaVell Edwards. We've touched on it a little bit. We're really going to talk about it when we come back and just how BYU was able to get him as the head coach. We'll continue on with our guests, Brett Pyne and Duff Tittle. They're the authors of 100 Years of BYU Football, and we'll have more with them right after this. This is the Deep Blue Podcast on BYU Radio. Hey, Cougar fans, Jason Shepard here to talk about one of our other great BYU Radio podcasts, Big Stories. It's a show about amazing stories from Big 12 schools and beyond. Host Cleon Wall traveled to places like Tempe, Lawrence, Orlando, and other cities to find real-life tales from BYU's opponents, like Baylor grad Jimmy Durrell, who moved back to an impoverished Waco neighborhood to help those who couldn't help themselves. Cleon has plenty of stories just like that through the football and basketball seasons. Don't miss out. Find Big Stories on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Welcome back to the Deep Blue Podcast here on BYU Radio. I'm your host, Jason Shepard. My guests today, they're the authors of 100 Years of BYU Football, Duff Tittle and Brett Pyne joining me. And look, there is one name that usually comes up first when anybody has a connection to BYU football. One of the first names they will always bring up is LaVell Edwards. And everybody knows who he is. Everybody knows what he's done and what he meant to not just BYU football, but to college football. And before the break, Duff, you were talking about, the hey, maybe we should start throwing the ball a little bit more. I mean, it was unheard of at the time, and it was revolutionary and it's funny to think about that now with the way the game has evolved. But let's go back to when BYU was looking for a head coach. How did LaVell Edwards become the guy?
Well, he had been there for 10 years in the defensive side of the ball. And there were a couple of players, I know one for sure, and I believe there were multiple players that actually went and knocked on Elder Oaks' door, who was President Oaks at the time, and asked if they could talk to him about the vacancy. And there's a quote in the book where he said that experience had a huge impact on his thinking. That these young men would take the time to come and say how much they loved LaVell as a person and as an individual. And then eventually he was hired, going from the defensive coordinator to the head coach.
Well, and I think those years are kind of the forgotten years for LaVell. People don't talk about or know those years, but they really played a big part in who he was as a head coach. I mean, he was coaching high school, and they brought him in because he had coached Eldon Forti, who became the first team All-American, but in the offense that they ran at the time in high school, and the single wing. Yep. And and LaVell joked later about his resume is like, yeah, I didn't have all these winning seasons, but somehow they saw something in me. But he came in and he's coaching defense, but he's seeing some of these things evolve, and when he gets that chance, he just kind of knew it's like, hey, I need to just try to do something that's, like if I keep doing it the way it's been done, we're not going to be successful any more than we've been, and so we need to try something different. And really, the genesis of that and how all of the different pieces kind of fell together, and the different people that he brought in. Because that was really one of his geniuses, is that he and Patty, who's also we talk about in the book, but she's credited, he was just good at hiring good people and then letting them do their jobs, and that really played a big role in how this all developed. And I'm sure at the time they had no idea. I mean, I know not to bring up pro football, your allegiances, but Andy Reid and the Chiefs,
with reverence, Brett.
they have. I mean, he's acknowledged it's like, and even people like Mike Leach, how LaVell not only changed college football but professional football, and it was these kinds of things that people you found the right people that were willing to do the things and do it in a way. Like LaVell did, where he was always the leader and someone that brought everyone together and developed what became, really BYU's brand. The last 50 years we're top 10 in wins, since LaVell became the head coach.
So how did he do this? Because this was a defensive guy, and then he comes in and look, recruiting is not like it is today. It was completely different, but yet he kept bringing in, as the program grows and starts to get its footing and starting to have more and more success, he starts bringing in All-American after All-American, and it's not just quarterbacks. It's at other positions. It's even on the defensive side. Mm-hmm. How did he do this? Because it's remarkable when you talk about what he meant in terms of changing the game, but then specifically with BYU, to turn it into what it became and is today. How did he do it?
I think in many ways it's a miracle. You have this small religious institution in the Rocky Mountains who has not had a history of playing the game at any level really very well. He saw things that was happening with Tommy. He had played for a guy at Utah State that went on to coach at Stanford, and for a short time period did the same thing with a guy named Jim Plunkett and won a couple of conference championships, won some Rose Bowls. And as we dug into the research, all these little things started to come to play, and we started to realize the men who saw the vision of the forward pass all kind of knew each other. and they were friends. And that's one of the more fascinating things that came out of this process, even though we'd done other books, was that this interwinding thing of coaches that were doing a similar thing. And then you have a situation where Virgil Carter is an All-American at BYU. He goes to the league. He ends up playing for the Cincinnati Bengals, who has a coach by the name of Bill Walsh, who goes on to, in essence, do a similar thing. Yeah, a few people have heard of that name, and revolutionized the game at the NFL level. And he and LaVell, as it turns out, knew each other and would talk occasionally and share coaching ideas with each other and personnel. And so that's some of those conversations and things that we found in digging deep on this were quite remarkable and play into the whole narrative of he had a vision. He knew how to go get the right coaches to make it work. He also was communicating with a lot of coaches across the country who had the same vision. And then once you started to, get things going, then everybody that was a quarterback or a wide receiver was like, yeah, I think I might want to go play there. And ultimately, though, it was LaVell. I mean, being around him for the later part of his career was one of the highlights of my career. Just getting to know him and realizing the type of person he was, and realizing that really is what makes it unique, is how much people loved him, and he loved people. That's the reason. And I'll tell you just a quick little side story. In about 2006, I think, he was given a special award at the ESPN College Football Award Show for career achievement. And I had the opportunity to fly to Orlando and meet him and Patty there for this show. And we did there's a little dinner kind of casual thing that night before. And we were sitting over in the corner, the three of us. And it was name person after name person in the world of college and professional football that came over out of their way in the corner of this little restaurant to talk to him and to have conversation with him. And, growing up here, he's LaVell, right? He's a legend here. But what I learned that night is he's a legend coast to coast. And especially those in the profession came over to really, in a way, kind of show reverence and appreciation for what he had done at the college level and how he had changed football. It was amazing. It was who's who, both in the broadcast world and the coaching world. Even players were coming over, former players. It was one of the most incredible things that's ever happened to me in my career, was to be, in essence, a fly on the wall and see that happen.
One of the things that sometimes is hard to do, especially when you've reached that legend status, which LaVell certainly was. Now, he never acted like it,
True.
But he was that.
Yeah.
Is a lot of times people, when you reach that status, you've moved past being approachable. LaVell never had that. LaVell was always approachable. LaVell would always talk to whoever, and it wasn't just lip service. He was having a conversation with another human being, and he enjoyed it. And I think that's one of his greatest strengths, is how he made other people feel. I don't think that can get talked about enough.
I completely agree. I mean, in fact, I think as the history progressed and his team started getting better and people became more knowledgeable about who he was because of his success on the football field, and so then people are seeking him out because hey, what are you doing? And they get to know him as a person. That stretch that went like 79 through 85, for example, where they were just, one of the top 2 or 3 teams in the country in terms of wins. That 84 national championship, it's not really spoken of, but how beloved LaVell was, I think also helped BYU in, when people are voting for and wanting to say, well, did they play the toughest schedule? Did this happen? Did that happen? I don't think there was hardly any person that had ever come to know LaVell or heard about LaVell that didn't respect LaVell. And so it wasn't like people didn't want to vote for him, if that makes any sense. Mm-hmm. It's like he was an asset that way for the team too, because people knew that LaVell cared about them, and so conversely they couldn't help but also care about LaVell.
You guys have both mentioned his wife, Patty, multiple times, and not sure if any of this success would be possible without Patty being by his side. What did that relationship mean to BYU football?
I had the opportunity to go sit down with Patty in the process of creating this book. It was, of course, I've known her for a long time, but that experience was really, I don't know, it's meaningful. It was just, we sat at her home, we talked, and there are things that Patty was doing quietly in addition to supporting LaVell 100% that also changed things at BYU first and then nationally amongst the wives of the coaches and the players. So she was the first to say, hey, the wives need a support mechanism, because she had been through it and she knew it. Whether you're the wife of a coach or a player, she knew the importance of, she had developed relationships with other wives around the country, and she knew how much that meant to her. And so she started doing that here first at BYU with the players' wives and the coaches' wives. And she would have them up to the house a few times a year, and they'd have dinner together. And she created this sisterhood amongst those women at that time that is quite remarkable. And then later on, took that to the next step with some other women who formed the Coaches' Wives Association. And in fact, interestingly, it was Jim Harbaugh's mom and Patty who were the first two that got together up in Park City. They had come in to play us, and they spent a day up in Park City together, just the wives. And it started this genesis of, what if we had a wives coaches group? And so when they went to the next convention, they formed it. While they were at the convention, the coaches convention with their husbands, they formed the wives. And that organization now is blossomed past college athletics and now takes in all coaches' wives across the country. There's more than 3,000 women that are involved in that organization. I think it's incredible, and it was led by Patty and Mrs. Harbaugh, and I don't think people know that. And I think, going back to what Brett said about the respect for LaVell, I think there's equal respect for Patty across the country amongst the coaches and their wives. And when they would come to town, they would entertain. They would take care of the visiting teams' families and wives. And it's an amazing legacy. It really is what it is, and still goes on today.
She's one of those ones that still to this day people talk about, honestly, with reverence because of what she not necessarily just what she has meant to BYU football, but what she means to them on a personal level. Mm-hmm. It's very special to hear people talk about Patty Edwards and the relationship that they have with her. There's so many things that we could sit and talk specifically about, but we can't talk about all of them. I got to go buy the book and read some of these things. But one thing I did want to ask you about, President Reese. He was speaking on the 100th year of BYU football, and he said this. He had this quote. He said, "At the end of the day, if we're going to be an institution that says that we are believers in Jesus Christ and we follow Jesus Christ, it's got to manifest itself in the classroom, and it's got to manifest itself on the football field." So based on what President Reese said, how do you think BYU football has fulfilled that?
I think it's a great question. In a lot of ways, like you allude to, BYU football is a front porch to the university and the church because of the visibility that is there, that comes because of it. But the last 50 years, it's succeeded at an elite level, really. I mean, if you're top 10 in wins in the country, you have an individual at the helm like LaVell who had gained such respect and notoriety. And then you've seen that continue. You've seen the 2001 season. You've seen when Bronco Mendenhall's teams went on, a stretch that kind of rivaled some of those stretches that LaVell had in terms of success. And then you go independent, and you're kind of out on your own, and you're unique in that respect, peculiar, you could say, I guess, right? So all of those things building, and then the Big 12 coming along. It really has put the church in a position where people, can talk about it. And what does this mean? There's this BYU team they won the national championship at one point. Oh, they're still doing this and they're doing that. There's so many things and good things that the program does, beyond the football part of it, the way that they reach out and help with people in the community and things. And I think all of those things really have fulfilled that in the sense, and I think going to the Big 12 where you have an even larger stage is just going to see that continue to be the case.
How have you seen that, Duff?
I think it really, part of that is we have so many ways that we can communicate the message, right? Initially, we were the first live regular season game played on ESPN. That's amazing. When you think about just that is amazing, right? And then that partnership with ESPN that has gone on and on and on, and the games that we've played on that network and the audience that has seen us play, all of these things have kind of pieced together over time, little building blocks. And then, all of a sudden in the early 2000s, we get a call saying, hey, we've got this television network. Would you like to have something on Dish and Direct? And then BYU Radio goes on Sirius XM. And it's just one thing after the next that I think we have an ability to communicate globally as good as anybody in the country at the collegiate level. But ultimately, it comes down to the people. Just like LaVell, it comes down to the young men and young women who play athletics at BYU, and how they, not only how they do it and how they win and how they're successful. Look at the Olympics, but then how, who they are, and the stories that come from the good things that they're doing. That's really, like Tom Hommel says, the secret sauce is the people and the student athletes. As I look back at my career, I probably had opportunities to go other places that I just was not really interested in, because I love working with the student athletes here at BYU. They're the cream of the crop. They're, in so many different ways. And it's not just very much one-sided cream of the crop. They're great athletes. They're great human beings. They do service. They have testimonies of Christ. And that comes out in their daily lives. And so we have all this communication channels, but it's the messaging that can come from that really makes a difference. And the people that have come from here that have gone on, like your legendary coach, Andy, for your Chiefs.
Thank you. Good Chiefs.
They are your Chiefs.
Well, and I want to reemphasize something that you brought up a minute ago. And I don't think there are countless examples throughout the history of BYU football. But we don't have to go any further than this past season with BYU football. And we've all heard the stories from, oh my gosh, you guys were just so nice. We couldn't believe how nice you were. We have never experienced an opposing venue where we were treated so kindly. And I can't think of a better way to be an example of our Savior than by making people feel comfortable and feel good about the situation. Look, as sports fans, we're always going to remember if our team won or lost. Along the course of the way, we may forget certain specifics on exactly how everything happened. But one of the things that we're never going to forget is how we felt, how somebody made us feel. And I think that in hearing feedback from other people is something that BYU, first of all, wants to do and is doing. And I think people are seeing that and feeling that. And I think that goes exactly to what President Reese was talking about.
I would agree with that. And during the time of traveling that Brett and I have had over the last 25 plus years, we feel that when we go to another place, when we go to Nebraska and are treated so well, or you go to Notre Dame and other places that we've been to, where you leave there thinking, wow, those people were so kind and friendly. And there's a competition going on, right? But it doesn't mean that it has to expand outside of when the game's over, the game's over. Right. And it's been really cool to see our fans really engage in that idea of we should be treating people like the Savior would.
Well, and Jason, to your point on this topic, I think this last year is a good example, like you brought up. In a way, BYU football, even when they're not the ones actually doing it, because of BYU football, it gives other people surrounding the event opportunities to do things that do impact people. And, like our team, for example, in West Virginia, we're getting ready for the game, and we're out there in that beautiful part of the country. But while we're getting ready for the game, our alumni association and, people from our university communications and all these groups that have been collaborating with people from the West Virginia, and, these service projects that they come together and they collaborate with, and they make it so it's not just like a, hey, show up and get excited to go to the game, but it's like there's some meaning behind it to do some things to help. And it was amazing to see how many of the faculty and people at West Virginia were genuinely impressed and touched by, instead of coming in like, hey, well, all we care about is, beating you guys in football or whatever the, attitude may be. But I've heard people out there say, it's like, hey, we've got to step up our game. It's like there's a new level of something to aspire to in our league now, and it's like where you're making those good impressions, and those weren't the football players and the coaches out there doing that. That was all the people there for the game that were doing their good things and making an impact, and I think that plays into what President Reese said as well.
Yeah, people certainly remember that, and I think if I heard it or saw it once, I heard it 100 times. Well, when we play you guys, we want to beat you, but afterwards we're going to root for you the rest of the year. Like it's just one of those things which is super cool. Guys, this has been awesome, and people listen to this like, wow, you guys hit on a lot. Tip of the iceberg of the stuff that's in this book. For those that have not had a chance to pick it up already, where can they get this for themselves if they'd like to get the book?
Well, all Desert bookstores, and at desertbook.com. It's on Amazon, and the bookstore on campus. I'm sure there's other places. Those are the ones that we know they're for sure you can get it.
Yeah,
there.
Desert Book. They've been great working with them. So I mean, that's the for sure place to go and get it. And then we've really appreciated all that they've done and believing in why this could be an important project. So if you're looking to go get a nice Christmas gift, there's one out there for you. So
if you're anybody in your family, anyone you know is a BYU fan, this is certainly something that they would enjoy. I can promise you that. Guys, thank you so much. It's a pleasure. I get to see you guys all the time. It's kind of fun to be in this setting and be able to do something like this. Great job on the book. It's fantastic. And appreciate all the hard work that you guys put into getting that out there. So thank you so much, and thanks for doing the Deep Blue podcast. I appreciate it.
It's our pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
You bet.
It's fun to sit and talk.
It is. All right, thanks once again to my guests, Duff Tittle and Brett Pyne. My name is Jason Shepard. Josh Bergstrom and Ben Hall produced this episode. Deep Blue's senior producer is Cleon Wall. You can download and subscribe to Deep Blue on all podcast platforms or find all episodes on the BYU Radio app. Deep Blue is a production of BYU Radio.